Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Recovery Talk. So in this week's episode, we are going to talk about starvation mode. What it is, why it happens, how to get out of it, how it manifests, and I'm also going to do a bit of myth busting around starvation mode. So if you have been listening to this podcast before, you probably know that I'm very interested in human metabolism and especially how human metabolism responds to starvation and also to refeeding. I have spoken about this in previous episodes, but I think it was about time to tackle starvation mode specifically and what that term really means and what it doesn't mean. So let's get into it. What is starvation mode? So the way that I define starvation mode is a series of metabolic adaptations that the body is making in response to being in an energetic deficit. It is essentially a mode that the body has available that it activates when it's realizing that not enough energy is coming in. It's kind of like when your phone is starting to go low on battery, you can turn on low battery mode where it reduces some functions just to save energy. It's a little bit like that, but for the body. Here's the thing, and this is incredibly important to know when it comes to starvation mode. Starvation mode is a temporary mode, a temporary adaptation in response to being in an energetic deficit. It is not a permanent thing that damages your metabolism forever. I often hear this narrative of my metabolism is damaged forever by people who are still yo-yo dieting, and they're still yo-yo dieting because they believe their metabolism is damaged forever. And please don't get me wrong, there absolutely are certain health conditions that can impact metabolism, that can impact your weight regulation, appetite regulation. That is true and real, but in and of itself, starvation mode is a temporary mode that gets turned back off again when you are increasing your intake and showing your body that food and energy is an available resource, and you're showing that over a period of time. So when someone is in a intensive energetic deficit, what happens is that the body starts turning down its basal metabolic rate, aka BMR. This is the amount of calories that is burned by complete rest. And no, a calorie calculator can't necessarily completely correctly identify this because it will vary a bit from person to person. And also some of these calorie calculators, for some reason there's a miscommunication there where some people calculate their basal metabolic rate and think that is what they need because they're like, oh yeah, this is what my body burns in a day. No, this is what your body burns essentially to keep your heart beating. This is bare minimum. And when there is starvation, this rate goes down. So your body basically tries to save calories by deprioritizing certain metabolic functions. So what are these functions? Well, it's important to say that it is a little bit individual. Different bodies will prioritize differently. So for example, for some people, they may notice disruptions in their sex hormones. People assigned female at birth may notice that their periods become irregular or completely missing. But again, different bodies prioritize differently, so this is not always the case. This is due to the hypothalamus basically deprioritizing fertility and deprioritizing reproduction. It's noticing that it's not enough energy coming in to carry a child. So it switches things off, estrogen levels drop, which unfortunately also can lead to bone density loss. It is very important for me to get forward that if you're someone assigned male at birth, you are not immediately let off the hook just because you don't menstruate. This is a common misconception that I see amongst males where they're thinking, oh, well, I'm not a female, so I should be fine. I shouldn't have any bone density loss, like I'm protected somehow. So it is true that men on average tend to handle a slightly lower body fat percentage than women, just because men and women tend to have just slightly genetic differences in terms of how they carry weight. But men will still have significant adverse consequences by being in an energetic deficit. And in the case of anorexia nervosa, we actually tend to see more severe illness in males. So these hormonal discrepancies from being in starvation mode in men tend to manifest as a drop in testosterone levels, a drop in sex drive, that also can happen in females, by the way, and also erectile dysfunction is very common, and bone density loss. So it's interesting when it comes to starvation mode and being in starvation mode. Like I said, different bodies will prioritize differently. I have worked with people who have been severely underweight, severely undernourished, yet they have had regular menstrual cycles. And I've also worked with people who have been on high calorie intakes for a while, they've been weight restored, they've been resting, yet their period just won't come back. Also, my lived experience, I'm someone, when I developed my eating disorder, I lost my period very quickly. For me, that seems to be like the first thing to go. Whilst other people may, like I said, never lose their period if they're someone who normally menstruates, or they may find that they only lose it when they're like very, very, very undernourished and underweight. So again, different bodies prioritize differently. And this just makes complete sense from a, evolutionary point of view. Yes, in a group, it would make sense if a lot of people would respond to there being famine by shutting off fertility. But if everyone responded that way, we would die out, right? The human race would die out. So it would make sense that in a group of people, there's going to be someone whose hormones are a bit more starvation resilient. This does not mean necessarily that their whole bodies are starvation resilient. It just means that their hormones are a little bit more sturdy to responding to starvation. But of course, the way an eating disorder works, the eating disorder is always looking for evidence that you're fine, you're not really undereating, you're not really underweight. So of course, people experiencing a bit more of a sturdy hormonal response to starvation than the average person will then think that means that they're fine and there won't be any consequences for them being starved. That is not the case. You can still have all the dangers of starvation. You can still also even have problems with your bone density. Just because you have your period doesn't mean that you're automatically fine. But it is also worth mentioning that for a lot of people, being in starvation mode will have negative hormonal effects, because the hypothalamus is essentially shutting down sex hormone production, which creates hypothalamic amenorrhea in females and hypothalamic hypogonadism in both males and females. Another way to notice that you are in starvation mode is feeling very cold all the time. Again, everyone is different, but this is a very classical one where someone's body temperature will have issues regulating itself. It's a bit like if you're on a budget, you turn down the heating to save money. And when you are in a restrictive space, that is essentially what's going on in your body, right? You are on a calorie budget often in your own head. I call this the calorie budget mindset, by the way. I made a podcast episode about that in the past called the calorie budget mindset. But also just in terms of your body, it is operating on less energy, so it has to be more energy efficient. So it will down prioritize non-essential functions, such as keeping you warm, which is important, but it's not absolutely essential. It's like, yeah, you can suffer, be a bit cold. You're not going to drop dead from that, are you? Another thing that it often does is slowing down your digestion, so-called gastroparesis. So gastroparesis is also something that can be caused by other health conditions. So it's just important for me to let people know that being constipated and having digestive issues isn't immediately a sign that you're in starvation mode. But a lot of people in starvation mode will notice that they get a lot of digestive issues. Food just takes longer to pass through the system, and they may also get a lot of bloating. Some people start noticing they get quite sensitive to foods that they haven't been sensitive to before. And again, the eating disorder loves to jump in here and blame the food, when actually what's going on is something that is a response to the absence of food or not getting in enough food. Yet the eating disorder will go and blame, it's the bread, it's the pasta, it's this and that. And yeah, again, there are conditions that can affect digestion. That doesn't have to do with being in starvation mode. And if you have, for example, celiac disease, yeah, the pasta may be the problem. But so many times I see people who are experiencing digestive issues relating to being in an energetic deficit, then going in and taking away foods. And unfortunately, often there are some healthcare professionals who are not adequately trained in eating disorders and energetic deficit and the metabolic effects of being in starvation mode, that then think that must be the way to go, right? If your stomach is a bit funny, we have to try and take away foods. And it just often creates more problems than it creates anything good coming from it. Slow digestion makes complete sense from like an energy efficiency point of view. Your body may notice that less food is coming in and it starts to just slow down the function overall. Like why should we waste all of this energy on a fast functioning, healthy digestive system? It is also incredibly important for me to get forward that if you are experiencing slow digestive system from an eating disorder, adding in more fiber probably won't make anything better. If anything, it may actually make things a bit worse, because these are foods that take a lot more work from your body to digest. So if you have delayed gastric emptying and your stomach is just slow, and this is due to being in an energetic deficit, you probably would actually do better with more like easy to digest foods, such as not going for the highest fiber foods, but actually going for something like white pasta instead of whole grain pasta, white bread instead of whole grain bread. That actually can have a bit of a better effect on you because it's easier for the body to process and digest. And it often creates less bloating and less constipation. But your eating disorder, of course, won't like that. Your eating disorder will be like, no, you have gut issues, so you need to eat more fiber, so you should eat more vegetables, so let's just eat tons of veggies, and then wonder, why does my stomach hurt? Why am I so bloated? More fats, less fiber can in many cases just do you so much better. I know it goes against all of the traditional advice, but this is because traditional advice isn't meant for people with restrictive eating disorders. Average Joe that has a bit of constipation is probably in a very different metabolic state that you are in if you are in starvation mode. Of course, get these things checked with your doctor, but a doctor can probably confirm that, yeah, if you are essentially starving yourself, things are going to slow down in terms of your digestion. And the best way to get rid of that is to eat more. And you can make your life a little bit easier by eating more energy-dense foods that are easy on your stomach without necessarily becoming obsessive around, oh my God, I need to eat this specific way not to upset my stomach, because that can also, for a lot of people, become a form of eating disorder that can intertwine a bit with a very real underlying condition, often irritable bowel syndrome. People often think if you have any kind of underlying digestive issues, it means that the eating disorder can't come and play a role. But very often these go hand in hand. I remember reading a study, I can't remember the exact figure, but I believe it was something around like 80%, maybe more than that, of people who entered a residential or hospital stay, I can't remember which one was, for anorexia nervosa had digestive symptoms that was so severe that it would classify as irritable bowel syndrome. But of course, because they had anorexia nervosa, they weren't diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome, because irritable bowel syndrome would typically be diagnosed when someone doesn't have any other underlying issue that we can see is the cause. Irritable bowel syndrome is more, yeah, you have gut issues. That's pretty bad, but we have no clue why you're having this issue. Even though oftentimes we do see underlying conditions that can activate irritable bowel syndrome, such as, an eating disorder. I think in many cases there may be an eating disorder underlying in a lot of people with irritable bowel syndrome. Anxiety disorders are very, very real, have a very real physical effect on digestion. Visceral hypersensitivity, people with irritable bowel syndrome often way more sensitive to whatever's going on in their guts. And also certain conditions such as SIBO, which is also something that's more common in people with eating disorders. Again, because of this delayed gastric emptying and things just brewing in the stomach for longer. So what are some other common physical manifestations of being in starvation mode? Well, one is experiencing brittle nails, hair loss, dry skin. So our hair and skin needs energy, and it needs especially also fats to be its best and healthiest self. And when you're not getting that in, you're going to look a little bit dull and brittle, and more skincare or hair serums is probably not going to solve it. This is another example of something where different people experience very different manifestations, because again, it's kind of like like I mentioned with the hormones. Some people can be severely starved but have long, healthy hair. Same thing goes with the gut health, right? Some people may be very starved, but they may not have significant digestive issues. When I look back at pictures of myself during my eating disorder, it's like I just looked a bit unhealthy and unwell. It was hard to pinpoint exactly what it is. Of course, in my case, I did look quite underweight. But even beyond that, it was just like I just didn't have that glow. My skin looked a little bit aged, right? And eating disorder would tend to like prematurely age you quite a bit. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with looking aged. I think that, we all are going to age differently. I don't necessarily like this idea that you should always look your youngest, as young as possible. I think that's a little bit almost ageist in a way, but I do think that we can agree that looking a lot older than you are due to an eating disorder, not looking your best due to an eating disorder, we can probably agree is maybe not what people want. So yes, embrace aging, but let that aging be a sign that you have truly lived, that you had fun, that you've smiled, rather than your body just having been too stressed for too long. So when it comes to starvation mode, the most obvious symptom is not necessarily the ones that I mentioned, because as I said, these can manifest a bit differently for different people. Most obvious one is just pretty simply that you are burning a lot less energy, and that when you're starting to eat more, you may experience that you're gaining a lot of weight very fast. So there can occasionally be some abnormalities in this, especially in severe anorexia nervosa, where we see that someone enters refeeding and start dropping weight immediately. But most common, if someone is in starvation mode, when they are eating more, their body will respond by holding on to a bit more weight immediately. This is temporary, and the best way to get through it is by not going back to restriction. That is actually going to make the issue a lot worse. Instead, it is just keep eating and trusting the process, because essentially your body is holding on to a bit more weight when it's getting more food because it has been starved. Very natural, understandable reaction. As soon as your body is understanding that, oh, more food is coming in on a consistent basis rather than just being like a one-off Last Supper mentality kind of thing, then your body is going to be like, okay, we don't need to hold on as much or as tightly. Your body has a natural set point weight range that it wants to be in and that it will fight to be in. The way that a lot of people overshoot this weight is by just constantly dieting, constantly back and forth, on and off a diet, and then their body is in perpetual quote-unquote saving mode, where it's trying to save up weight because it's just waiting for the next time it will be starved again. Some people who have gone through starvation mode may experience a little bit of an overshot period. I have done a podcast episode about this in the past. Not everyone experiences this, but I would say it's more common than not. They may also notice temporarily that their weight is distributed in a bit of a different way. So, for example, someone who has just been starved may find that they initially gain a bit more weight in their abdominal area. It's just a very common starvation response. This is where your internal organs are, your most important organs are there. So of course, your body's going to prioritize storing weight where it is the most important. The issue people do, of course, is then jumping on another diet, and then the body is like, oh yeah, we were right to do that. We need to hold on to that. Very often what you see as someone recovers and they stay recovered is that their weight may shift around a little bit, right? They're like, it's not necessarily always that the number on the scale changes, but more so that things just kind of evens out a little bit. I think that would be the best way to explain it. Even though some people may experience that if they have overshot, they may drop a little bit of weight, even though they're not intending to. Whilst others may find that they recovered at a quote-unquote goal weight that was too low for them, and they may find that they gain a little bit of weight and then they settle somewhere. So it is also very important for me to get forward that storing a bit more weight in the abdominal area is not necessarily always a sign of, oh, it's because I've been starved in the past, right? Some people just carry weight that way. Like, we all have different shapes and sizes, and that's completely okay and fine. And I also think people have a tendency to think they carry more stomach fat than they do, just due to very unrealistic representations of how stomachs are supposed to look like. Like, we're supposed to have stomach fat. That's fine. It's normal. It's natural. It's healthy. And of course, there exist conditions such as insulin resistance, where we see excessive amounts of body fat being stored in the abdominal area as a result of an underlying condition. But in most cases, I see people who are convinced that their stomach is so much bigger than average when it actually isn't. So be aware of body dysmorphia popping in here as well. Not to mention, if you're bloated, often as a result of some of the things that I mentioned earlier, the delayed gastric emptying and things just going slower and you being constipated and reacting to food, that also will make your stomach look bigger. So, Another little thing when it comes to being in starvation mode. So typically we tend to say that starvation mode reduces the amount of movement that you're doing, the amount of like subconscious or unconscious movement that you're doing. So it may reduce things like fidgeting, may reduce, for example, maybe you're on the phone and you're in the past, you may be more likely to take the phone call standing up and walking around and pacing, whilst if you're in starvation mode, you may be more likely to sit down during the phone call, right? So it's like that like lower level invisible movement will often go down in starvation mode, almost like a hibernating bear. Your body go into that mode of we need to save energy, so it makes you more sluggish and tired. But there is a but here. Some people, especially people with anorexia nervosa, may have the complete opposite effect. They might find that when they are starved, or the more starved they are and the more weight they lose, the more hyperactive they become, the more fidgety they become. They almost have this drive to move, move, move. They just can't sit still. They pace around. They feel like doing movement and it feels like an itch in their body. They can't quite sit still. This is very specific to certain restrictive eating disorders, especially to anorexia nervosa. But it is important for me to get forward that just because you don't have this particular response to being in an energetic deficit doesn't mean that you don't have an eating disorder. Many people with eating disorders, even some people with anorexia nervosa, experience that starvation makes them more sluggish and tired. So I just don't want to invalidate anyone, but I do want to say that some people with eating disorders may notice that they don't get more tired with restriction. And also I've seen this phenomenon of people being really tired, but really like fidgety and feeling like they need to move at the same time. So it creates this like almost like this torture state from the body where it's like you're exhausted, but you're restless. And interestingly enough, your body tends to reduce the amount of calories it is burning by movement and by these kind of activities when you're starved. Again, your body is slowing down everything and trying to be like, okay, even if we are going to do these things, can we do them as energy efficiently as possible? Basically, what we call the thermic effect of exercise goes down. And for most people, being in starvation mode will mean that their so-called NEAT goes down. NEAT is what I mentioned, the fidgeting, changing postures, etc., and it stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Another thing to mention is that people who are in an energetic deficit, especially people with restrictive eating disorders or undergoing a prolonged period of being in deficit, we tend to see loss in muscle mass. So people often don't think they're losing muscle mass because they're like, oh yeah, but I'm losing weight and I feel like I look more quote unquote defined because, but I have less body fat. So I'm fitter, I'm stronger, I'm healthier. That's often what people think. But we do tend to see that there is muscle wastage because, again, if you are in an intense deficit, your body eventually is going to have to go and look for sources of energy. So it starts burning its own muscles. And having muscle wastage, which in cases where someone is quite undernourished, it is the norm rather than the exception. Even if people think that, but I can see my muscles more. Like I remember when I was at my lowest weight, I could see my muscles more, but I had muscle wastage. It's just important for me to get that forward. That just because you feel you can see the muscles more doesn't mean that you're more muscular. So having lower amounts of muscle mass also means that you burn a bit less energy at rest. And when it comes to gaining muscle mass, one of the most important things you can do is to work on being in an overall energy surplus. In the cases of someone with restrictive eating disorder, you probably would be better off, especially if you have very compulsive movement and a very, tired, undernourished body, to just rest. And then you can take up something like weightlifting in the future if that's healthy and non-disordered for you. But overall, when you are starved, you actually gain muscle mass by resting. When you're restoring weight, yes, you're restoring body fat, but you also are restoring muscle mass if you have muscle wastage. And that muscle wastage that I'm talking about is not necessarily something that you can just hack and get out of by lifting weights and eating lots of protein. Again, if you are in a significant energetic deficit, if your body is starved, it's going to have consequences. So another common effect of being in starvation mode is brain fog, sluggish thinking, just not feeling as sharp. Then again, it should be noticed that some people, this may be a little bit less common, but there are some people that say that being in an energetic deficit makes them more clear, especially during periods of more acute starvation. This is not necessarily like a prolonged clearness. And I think a lot of times people who think that starvation makes them more clear, if you ask the people around them, like, hey, would you say this person is like present and clear and thinking sharp? A lot of times they will say no. And I've seen this sometimes in clients who are very convinced that starvation makes them clearer and sharper, and then they are expressing, like what I see is actually someone who has certain cognitive deficit as a result of their eating disorder, someone who's very forgetful, not quite there, can't quite think, can't quite focus, but they feel more focused and they feel more sharp, but they aren't, right? It's more like a subjective feeling of it. Then again, everyone is different, but in general, we do tend to see that starvation, especially not necessarily how you feel from day to day, meal to meal, but like on a bigger basis, we tend to see a negative cognitive effect of being in an energetic deficit. And the long-term effects of being in an energetic deficit, especially if it is a severe, prolonged energetic deficit with being at a too low weight, we can see pretty serious consequences on the brain, on the heart, on the bones, internal organs. The good thing is that a lot of these things can be restored and repaired. Some of them may not be fully restored and repaired. For example, tooth damage, bone damage, low bone density levels is something that may not be completely normalized. But a lot of these other things can be fixed. But it can in some cases be a long and tedious journey. And the negative effects of starvation can also even complicate recovery of itself, right? For example, feeling, having a lot of digestive issues can be like, may complicate recovery and make it like, hey, like I'm trying to recover, but my stomach hurts all the time and I have digestive issues. What do I do? So it is also important to kind of acknowledge that as well. But please don't take these signs as a sign that you shouldn't recover or that it is recoverer's fault. It is signs of the eating disorder, and sometimes it may get a little bit worse before better. Last one that I forgot to mention is that a lot of people who are in starvation mode may notice that even though they may feel more tired and sluggish, they may have some sleep problems. Insomnia, for example, is pretty common, or waking up at night. Again, this is something that can be caused by a lot of different things, but I do tend to see poor sleep quality in people with restrictive eating disorders. So psychologically, we also see a lot of effects of being in starvation mode. And I think to me, the most obvious one, the one that makes me immediately kind of make some like red flags go off in my head, is people being more obsessed with food. So this can often manifest as an increased interest in food and just being more interested in cooking, being more interested in talking about food, being more interested in what you're eating, what other people are eating. But it can also be just more rigidity around food, like it has to be a certain way, or you just get really irritable, really moody. Overall, it's more of that thing we call food noise. Thinking about food, organizing your life around food, also often movement as well, like that thing of like you fit your life around your movement and your meals rather than that being something that just fits into your life naturally. If you just cannot stop thinking about food and you're completely food obsessed and you just so happen to be someone who's restricting your intake, then there's a probably good chance that the underlying restriction is what's causing that food noise. So I also see people who are in acute stages of starvation mode is that there's a sense of a bit of a disconnect from the people around them, right? They may notice decreased interest in being social. They may notice decreased interest in pursuing romantic relationships, lower sex drive. Overall, it's like things that aren't related to food and in some cases movement just aren't as rewarding and interesting to them anymore. So it's like it limits their lives. It takes away them from being their truest self. And this is important for me to get forward because some people may be like, oh, what's the harm in living my life in starvation mode? Like, what's the problem? It's like, it takes you away from being your best, truest, most present self. It changes your interest, it changes your focus. So it's not just about all of these physical consequences that are, really uncomfortable and potentially very dangerous as well. It also is just that mental effect of just not being fully there. And what's so sad to me is when people think this is just their personality. Yes, there are people who are just a bit more introverted, like I'm one of them, like that's fine. But I do sometimes see people who think that, oh, I'm just someone who is obsessed about food and movement, and that's the only thing that matters in my life, and I'm not interested in making friends or having a relationship or going to school or going to work. Like my life revolves around food and movement because that's my interest and passion. Does it exist people who are very interested in food, very interested in movement without it being an eating disorder? Of course, but if that was a change that just so happened to coincide with you entering an energetic deficit, it is probably worth investigating if the eating disorder is playing a role. And especially sad is it when people internalize a lot of like the negative side effects of being in an energetic deficit, such as like being more snappy and moody and disinterested. And then they think that's just me. I'm just an irritable person. I'm just someone who's meant to snap on my kids or my partner or my parents. And it's like, is that really you, or is it something else going on? Because if your kids or your partner or your parents were in a constant energetic deficit and was essentially starving themselves, they probably would also feel how you're feeling. They probably would also feel quite grumpy and snappy and impatient and rigid. So be very careful to internalize those traits. Could it be that you are just someone who is a bit grumpier than average? Yes, of course, but the best way to find out that is by pursuing recovery and seeing how that is impacting your mood and emotions. And speaking of which, I've done an in-depth episode about this titled How an Eating Disorder Impacts Mood and Emotions. So do check that out if you're interested in seeing more like the actual like cognitive impacts on your mood and how you feel about yourself and other people when you're someone with a restrictive eating disorder. So when it comes to starvation mode, there are two myths that I see repeated over and over and over. And the first one, which is probably the most common one of these two, is that it is a permanent state of being. That if you, for example, have had anorexia when you were 20, at 40, no matter how much recovery work you're doing, you are going to have the same thing. Your metabolism is never going to heal. You're always going to feel that way. That is just not true. So as I may have mentioned, there are some side effects of an eating disorder that in some cases can be permanent or at least not be fully reversible, even though they can be improved. But when it comes to starvation mode, again, it's a mode. It is a state your body is in when it thinks it is starving. And the best way to get out of it is by showing your body you are no longer starving. Essentially getting in more energy, and getting in more energy without burning it all up through movement. Because this is sometimes what people do. They increase their intake, but then they also increase their movement. And then they're like, why do I still feel the same? So you need to increase your intake, and you need to do so consistently over a prolonged period of time. Because this is another thing that people do. They may, for example, go on a diet, and then they're like, well, I'm done with this diet now. And then they increase their intake, of course, after the diet. And then they notice, oh, it's been 2 weeks and my weight has gone up. Time to go on a diet again, right? You're going to have to give things time. You're going to have to trust the process. And you're also going to have to allow your body to go through whatever it needs to go through to get to that end point. For some people, they may have an episode where they are just extremely hungry and they're quote unquote binging, going through reactive hunger. And that may to them be like, whoa, okay, this is not really healthy. But it could be that this is what your body needed in that moment to get to the end point, which is eating more intuitively and quote unquote normally. Equally, maybe your body needs a bit of an overshot. Maybe you just have to embrace that. Maybe your body needs a break from movement. Maybe moving right now is just not what your body wants, and maybe something that can psychologically or even metabolically hold you back a bit. So let your body go through the different phases that it needs without judging those phases. Because I think sometimes people will go through a phase of, for example, reactive hunger or just craving only processed foods, and then they think, well, this can't be a healthy way to live for the rest of my life, not understanding that you are going through this phase so that the future you can live a life that is healthier, and does not necessarily mean that you're only going to eat really processed foods and never going to move and never going to, you get what I'm saying. So I think that's really important to just keep in mind that your body may have to go through some stages where you feel like you are quote unquote unhealthy to become healthy. And it is very common when you're getting out of starvation mode to experience an increase in appetite as you start eating more. And this can feel really scary, but it is completely normal. I have done a lot of podcast episodes about extreme hunger, reactive hunger in the past, so do check that out if you are in that boat. It is also something I did my master thesis on, something I spent a lot of time studying, working with people going through. So yeah, that's the number one myth that I see, that idea that my metabolism is broken forever. It is not broken forever. If what you're experiencing is starvation mode as a result of being in an energetic deficit, then increasing your intake and getting more energy in over a period of time will reverse that. So the second myth that I see, and I tend to see this more from people who are maybe more like they're dieting a lot rather than people with active eating disorders, because people with active eating disorders tend to know this is a myth. But I sometimes see people thinking that starvation mode can somehow completely stop weight loss. It can slow it down 100%, and sometimes people may eat less than a toddler and they are not losing any weight. But it is not true that starvation mode is a metabolic state that means that someone can eat 0 calories and still, for some reason, just not lose weight. That is not how it works. I understand it may not be as beneficial from a recovery point of view for me to correct that, but it is very important for me to correct all sorts of misinformation, regardless of whether or not it fits a quote-unquote agenda, right? I'm not operating with an agenda. I'm just trying to spread what the science is telling us. And you will, if you are not eating anything, you will lose weight. I mean, you will lose a lot more than body fat. You will lose, like I said, muscle mass, and you will start experiencing shrinkage of internal organs, right? Like, it is incredibly bad for you. But it is not true that starvation mode is something that can completely stop weight loss. But it absolutely can slow it down to a point where people may eat extremely little and often also do a lot of movement, but they are just not losing weight. And they may experience gaining weight eating very little. So if you are someone experiencing starvation mode, I would strongly encourage you to increase your intake, work with someone that can help you. If you're someone experiencing starvation mode because you have a restrictive eating disorder and you actually find this whole increasing thing quite difficult, work with someone who can help you, and work with someone who are familiar with the metabolic effects of an eating disorder. Because I sometimes see people being given the same mainstream advice that would fit someone without an eating disorder, or some people without an eating disorder, and then they wonder, why do I not feel better? For example, we know that an eating disorder can reduce your thyroid function, but this is very different from clinical hypothyroidism, which is an autoimmune condition. And then they are being given medications, and then that can actually be very dangerous. Or they may have delayed gastric emptying due to an eating disorder and been put on a high fiber diet for constipation, and then they just feel a lot worse. Or they may experience hypovolemic amenorrhea and then been told, just go on the pill. Or potentially even worse, they get misdiagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome and they're given lifestyle adjustment change advice that is completely the opposite of what they need if they have a restrictive eating disorder and actual hypovolemic amenorrhea, which, by the way, these two can often be differentiated on tests and also by clinical findings, but that's a bit beyond the scope of this episode. So work with someone who understands what you are going through, and don't necessarily take cookie cutter advice that's meant on a population level rather than people with restrictive eating disorders, because you are going to be in a different metabolic state. So get the support you need. I mean, I'm of course extremely biased, but I can of course recommend the Let's Recover coaches. So head over to letsrecover.co.uk if you are someone looking for one-on-one recovery coaching. It is also important for me to highlight that if you are very significantly starved, you may be very significantly weight suppressed, maybe at risk of refeeding syndrome, it is very important that you are doing the refeeding whilst being supervised, being medically checked up by having a doctor, maybe a dietitian, having some kind of medical team that can support you and keep you safe throughout this journey. Working with a coach or a therapist is awesome and important and can be absolutely life-changing for people if they find the right fit. But it is very important to say that this is not a replacement for medical support and supervision. So yeah, in short, starvation mode is your body being in a saving mode where it's essentially trying to save as much energy as it can, and as a result, it makes you physically and mentally not function your best. It is not a way to spend the rest of your life, and it has significant consequences, both short-term and long-term. It is not an innocent place to be in. Week after week, I work with people who have had eating disorders, whether it's a short period of time and a long period of time, and I see the consequences mentally and physically. Nobody ever says to me, I'm so glad I spent my life that way. It's always like, damn, why did I let it get this far? I need to get out of this. And you often don't realize how much it sucks to have spent your life in starvation mode until you get out of it. Right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you do, feel free to follow the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts, and then you get a little notification when I have posted another episode. You can also follow me on Instagram at Amalia Lee or letsrecover.co.uk. And also feel free to leave a rating for this podcast. See you in the next episode.